The conviction to lead. True leadership starts with a purpose, not a plan. Let me warn you right up front, my goal is to change the way you think about leadership. I do not aim merely to add one more voice to the conversation. I want to fundamentally change the way leadership is understood and practiced. For the better part of the last 3 decades, leadership has been a major cultural preoccupation and a professional obsession. Walk into an airport bookstore and you'll find the front tables filled with books promising to make you a better leader. Apparently frequent travelers have a healthy appetite for such advice. Walk into a Christian bookstore and you'll find ample evidence of the same hunger. If you are like me, you probably have read a small library of books on leadership, have attended numerous conferences and seminars, and keep up with leadership newsletters and professional journals when you find the time. Hotel conference rooms overflow with people listening to speakers deliver talks on leadership, and colleges and universities have gotten into the business as well, offering majors, degree programs, and even entire schools devoted to leadership studies. And yet, something is missing. I was born in 1959, right at the center of the golden age of American management. The managerial revolution was in full swing, and America's corporate leaders were managers of the first rank, but no one really thought of them as leaders. President John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, assembling a cabinet of youthful and technocratic managerial experts, largely drawn from America's leading corporations. Writer David Halberstam would later call these men the best and the brightest. Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, was considerably impressed by Kennedy's collection of managerial expertise. When he gushed about them to former Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, the Speaker retorted, "Well, Lyndon, you may be right, and they may be every bit as bright and intelligent as you say, but I'd feel a whole lot better about them if just one of them had run for sheriff once." We get his point. Those managers were among the brightest of their generation, but they managed the nation right into the disasters of the 1960s, such as the Bay of Pigs and Vietnam. Evidently, management is not the same thing as leadership. As a teenager, I was already looking for examples of leadership. I read about Winston Churchill, and I recognized that he was no mere manager. He was a leader of world-changing courage. When he spoke, a nation was given the hope and determination to fight a war that simply had to be won, against odds that left even many of his own friends and family convinced that England's future was already lost. I cut my political teeth working as a high school volunteer in Ronald Reagan's campaign for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976. Early that summer, no one had to ask me twice to be part of the line welcoming Governor and Mrs. Reagan into War Memorial Auditorium in Fort Lauderdale for a major speech. I got to shake Reagan's hand and then hear him speak. He did not talk about vague policy goals or speak in political bromides. He spoke with passion about ideas and the possibility of changing the way Washington was run. I recognized that he was a leader and that his leadership was transformational. I knew he believed what he was saying, and I could see that he persuaded others to believe with him. Reagan did not win the nomination in 1976, but he went on to carry 49 states in the 1980 presidential election. By that time, regardless of partisan identification, Americans were learning again to look for a leader. In college, I studied political science before ending up as a religion and philosophy major. If my exposure to political science was any indication, those professors cared very little about leadership. Every class seemed like a statistics assignment. In seminary, I had to take classes that were then called church administration. Trust me on this. The classes had little to do with the church and a lot to do with administration, but nothing to do with leadership. I had to create my own leadership studies program. You'll probably discover, or you may already know, that the same is true for you. I read historical biographies, observed the national and international scene, and began to read the emerging literature on political and business leadership. I took every opportunity to watch leaders up close, spending time with as many of them as I could. The Leadership Renaissance. Fast forward a few years to when I was editor of one of the oldest Christian newspapers in the nation. I received a call inviting me to join a small group of Christian leaders for a meeting on national drug policy at the White House. President George H.W. Bush was launching a major new initiative intended to stem the drug problem. The other leaders and I flew up together to Washington, and on the plane I noted that almost all of the pastors were talking about someone I had never heard of before. A California pastor named John Maxwell was recording sessions in which he was training his own staff in leadership. Pastors were buying his tapes and passing them around like the old Soviet dissidents used to exchange samizdat, forbidden political literature. Before long, John Maxwell was teaching leadership all over the country, and his books were showing up in airport bookstores. By the 1990s, leaders were flocking to Willow Creek Community Church in suburban Chicago, where Pastor Bill Hybels had started his series of huge leadership conferences. I attended one of the earliest. By the end of the decade, it was hard to even get a seat in Chicago, and most people would have to settle for a regional site elsewhere. What was going on? The hunger for leadership had reached every sector of our society, including business, government, education, cultural institutions, and, of course, the church. Christians, along with everyone else, wanted to develop leadership. It was not always so, although it is hard now to imagine a time when leadership had something of a bad name. The 20th century was a brutal and murderous laboratory for leadership. All you have to do is think of names like Vladimir Lenin, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong. In light of these horrors, many people began to wonder if leaders and leadership were themselves the problem. Theodore Adorno and his colleagues at the University of Chicago suggested this in their 1950 book, The Authoritarian Personality. They seemed to claim that any ambition to lead was based on unhealthy psychological needs and would produce dangerous results. This mentality took root in the culture of the 1960s, where counterculture groups demanded the abolition of many leadership positions, and the larger society grew increasingly nervous about the nature of leadership. Educators followed suit with classrooms in which the teacher's role was to be just a fellow learner, no longer the sage on the stage. Of course, it didn't work. It couldn't work. The nation needed leaders. Businesses needed leaders. Even anti-leadership movements needed leaders. And teachers had better know more than their students. The church desperately needs leaders as well. Congregations and Christian institutions need effective leaders who are authentically Christian, whose leadership flows out of their Christian commitment. Wherever Christian leaders serve, in the church or in the secular world, their leadership should be driven by distinctively Christian conviction. The last 3 decades have seen the emergence of a renaissance in leadership, and the deep hunger for leaders has never been more evident than now. Like me, you want to grow as a leader in order to be ready for all the leadership opportunities you may be called to accept. So, what is the problem? It is not a lack of interest, a shortage of books and seminars, or a dearth of leadership development programs. Nor is the problem a lack of attention to what leaders do and how they do it. The problem is a lack of attention to what leaders believe and why this is central. The two cultures of modern Christian leadership. The problem is that the evangelical Christian world is increasingly divided between groups we might call the believers and the leaders. The believers are driven by deep and passionate beliefs. They are heavily invested in knowledge, and they are passionate about truth. They devote themselves to learning truth, teaching truth, and defending truth. They define themselves in terms of what they believe, and they are ready to give their lives for these beliefs. The problem is many of them are not ready to lead. They have never thought much about leadership and are afraid that thinking too much about it will turn them into mere pragmatists, which they know they shouldn't be. They know a great deal and believe a great deal, but they lack the basic equipment for leadership. As one proverbial deacon said of his pastor, "Oh, he knows a lot, but he can't lead a decent 2-car funeral procession." The leaders, on the other hand, are passionate about leadership. They are tired of seeing organizations and movements die or decline, and they want to change things for the better. They look around and see dead and declining churches and lukewarm organizations. They are thrilled by the experience of leading and are ardent students of leadership wherever they can find it. They talk leadership wherever they go and are masters of motivation, vision, strategy, and execution. The problem is, many of them are not sure what they believe or why it matters. They are masters of change and organizational transformation, but they lack a center of gravity in truth. They often ride one program after another until they run out of steam. Then they wonder, what now? You deserve to know exactly who I am and why I am writing this book. I want to turn the believers into leaders and the leaders into believers. My goal is to knock the blocks out from under the current models of leadership and forge a new way. I stake my life on the priority of right beliefs and convictions, and at the same time I want to lead so that those very beliefs are perpetuated in others. If our leaders are not passionately driven by the right beliefs, we are headed for disaster. At the same time, if believers cannot lead, we are headed nowhere. My goal is to redefine Christian leadership so that it is inseparable from passionately held beliefs, and to motivate those who are deeply committed to truth to be ready for leadership. I want to see a generation arise that is simultaneously leading with conviction and driven by the conviction to lead. The generation that accomplishes this will set the world on fire. I want to see that happen, and I think you do too.